So of course, one of the reasons people want to age in place is power of their neighborhood, their community, the ability to stay close to friends and family. And now we're going to bring on Marc and Eddie to talk about that important topic, the power of community in longevity. And we're doing against the backdrop. I don't know that we need those two chairs. Do we? I think we do. I mean, you can keep them there. I mean, Marc can talk to his two friends on the right. And of course, against, yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Imaginary friends on stage. Beautiful. I'm supposed to introduce Marc Freedman. People have talked about him all morning long, so I don't feel like there's a reason to say anything other than Marc Freedman, co-CEO of CoGenerate. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ken. And I think Ken pointed out that I'm in that small group of people who've been at all of the Century Summit so far. I'm going to put that on my resume. But I got to say, it's a special treat today to be able to be in conversation with Eddie Garcia, who's a friend and somebody who I've admired greatly. And I know we're supposed to keep the introductions at a minimum. And in fact, when I went to the code on the tables, you know, and I was expecting to get a message from Google about needing to upgrade my memory because Eddie has accomplished so much and in such a relatively short period of time. He's a partner in the healthcare consulting firm Hesperian, but he's also the founder and the chair of the Foundation for Social Connection. He's the vice chair of the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness. He holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins, and he's a social entrepreneur, thought leader, and all-around bastion of wisdom. So welcome. And I thought we would start. The official title for this session is What Communities Can Do to Foster Social Capital. And I thought it might be a good place to start to just talk a little bit about communities. How do you define community? What constitutes community? So tell me what you're thinking on that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Marc. And I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's very kind. And thank you, Stanford University, for hosting us and for the Stanford Center on Longevity for this program. It's my first time here, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I also mentioned that I was quite sick, and I'm just putting that there. I was hospitalized for a few weeks, and my brain is quite fuzzy, so I'll be looking down for my notes a lot, and I apologize for that, for not being more present with the conversation. So Marc asked me, what is community? And I think it's really important for us to think about community in the broadest terms. That can be geographic delineations, right? We all are familiar with the neighborhoods that we live in or the cities that we live in. But more broadly, communities can mean things like in how we relate to each other. So thinking about delineations of folks that relate according to their race or ethnicity, thinking about people that share the same church or community clubs, or thinking more broadly about how we all like the same artists. So think about Taylor Swift fans or Jimmy Buffett or the Beatles. By doing so, we have the opportunity to foster belonging, to think about opportunities to create more change, and to think about opportunities for how we foster communities in the broadest sense. Excuse me. And one common theme across those communities, thriving communities, is that everyone within those communities have the opportunity to relate to each other and to think about opportunities to have compassionate action to take on behalf of that community when the time comes. So for us, we really think about these opportunities in their broadest sense so that we can think of new programs and solutions for the community level.
You know, I was thinking in the context of the themes of the Century Summit, and particularly today, about the relationship between older adults and community and the community of generations of people of different ages. And I was reminded that in the late 1940s, Walter Reuther, the UAW leader, described older adults as too old to work, too young to die. And they were sort of shoved to the margins of society. And it led to a movement around retirement communities where older people could have not only a sense of community and affiliation, but also identity. In a society that hated old people, they could pretend to be young people. And so if everybody was old, nobody was old. And that contributed, though, to this paradox, this mismatch we have now, where we heard this morning about the new Map of Life report's emphasis on age diversity. We have the most age diverse society, arguably, in human history, and also the most age segregated societies, where people are going to places like those retirement communities. In fact, in the last census, the fastest growing metropolitan area in America was none other than the Villages in Florida, the age segregated community there. And I think that there's a big challenge around communities and older people in a way that doesn't just create communities apart, but communities that are integrated into the fabric of life. And if our topic is communities and social capital, and we talked about communities, I didn't want to wait to ask you about why you decided to focus on these issues and the issue of social isolation and loneliness. Is it a purely intellectual and professional passion, or are there personal roots as well?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Mark. And it's really both things. And if this is an opportunity for me to be a little vulnerable, which I already started with my illness, for me, it's very personal. So I grew up, and also my story is not unique. So I grew up in a very small town in rural Ohio, a very poor town with little economic mobility. The community setting, I've always found the people there to be very hardworking and kind, but also sheltered from cultural, technological, and economic advancements. There was very little upward mobility, as I mentioned. No places for leisure or gathering were present. Access to information via the internet was very scarce. So exposure to outside communities and exposure to diversity in thought, culture, and economic opportunity was a rarity. That background overlaid my personal characteristics, which also further isolated me and created chronic loneliness for myself. And these were things like growing up in a family of 6 kids with 2 working parents. I luckily had all of my grandparents, which were integrate to my upbringing. I experienced an ongoing cycle of intergenerational poverty. I'm a gay man who was of mixed race and ethnicity, and a background of predominantly Caucasian community and staunchly Catholic. So for me, I really longed to achieve a sense of belonging my whole life, for access to community infrastructure that allowed for gathering, and for greater social capital, which is the topic of this, which for me was around high quality and functional relationships. Those experiences taught me very early on of the power of social connection, and the ability to keep a roof over my head, to keep me healthy and thriving, and to provide a possibility of future of possibilities.
Did you, how old were you when you started working on these issues professionally and as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I was mentioning to you earlier, I kind of knew right away as soon as I left home when I was 18 that there was power in thinking about health outcomes and our ability to thrive and well-being, and this connection to economic mobility. So very early on, I started working on a lot of social causes, looking at how we build community assets. I went to school in Boston, and there were community cares about AIDS was one organization. I focused my whole degree around comparative health politics and how other nations were addressing well-being and thriving from a systemic standpoint. And then had an opportunity just to continue that work into my present day, where I really focus on how we change systems of care. So we just heard about housing, but also the healthcare system, labor movements, nutrition programs, how we change those systems of care to best represent and work for the most marginalized among us. So broadly, that's my career and how I've been working on that. But we've seen a lot of statistics around social isolation and loneliness increasing over the last 20 years. For the more now than ever in history, we have over 60% of adults are claiming to be lonely. 25% of young adults do not know one of their neighbors. And we've seen historic distrust in American public society. We have seen lots of research around the negative effects of social isolation and loneliness. There's a common quote around 15 cigarettes per day, the same risk of premature mortality as smoking 15 cigarettes per day, but also an onslaught of other chronic conditions that are exacerbated by social disconnection. We also know on the inverse of that, that social connection has a protective effect on our ability to thrive. So that social connection programs do increase our risk of survival, but also have a bigger impact on our health and well-being than things like smoking cessation programs or physical activity programs. So the data is there, the research is there, and there's been little translation of that evidence into real-world solutions. So we started the Foundation for Social Connection in 2020 for that express purpose. How do we educate policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to take action in this space?
Why, at the same time that you were developing the foundation and the coalition, loneliness and isolation have really come to the forefront in a way that other areas where there are comparable research bases and rationales. Why has this issue taken hold in the culture?
Yeah, I think there's one big reason. We all experienced social isolation during the pandemic. So while there were many symptoms of social disconnection prior to the pandemic, so youth suicide rates were skyrocketing, gun violence in schools and other community settings were increased. We recently all went through that same sort of event of social disconnection, and now we can all relate to that. So it was an acute period, but there are many chronic experiences of this. So older adults living in home dwellings, unable to leave home, or in nursing homes. Those are chronic situations that have solutions that need to be brought to bear. And I think people can now empathize with those experiences. So we're seeing lots of movement at the federal level, finally, around these issues, and more champions are coming to light.
Do you think that this focus can not only help fight isolation, but also polarization? Do you see potential bipartisan convergence around this at a time when it's almost impossible to get that kind of convergence around anything?
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that up. So Senator Chris Murphy has actually brought up a bill that's looking at, from Connecticut, excuse me, that's looking at how we catalyze movement across the federal government around social connection and create an office to coordinate programs. But his interest in this topic came from the polarization along the political sphere. So he started to do a sort of speaking tour with his colleagues within Congress around their interest in connecting across the members themselves. He's still working on that sort of dialogue, and I'm hoping that he's fruitful in it. We are starting to see some bipartisanship on this topic. Congressman Flood from Nebraska recently announced that he'll be introducing a piece of legislation around the same topic. We've had lots of Democratic champions in the space. So Senator Tina Smith, I know, who spoke here last year, has also been a leader around social connection for older adults. And then there's, of course, the Surgeon General, who has recently released his advisory on social isolation and loneliness, and the healing power of social connection. There he lays out sort of 6 pillars of action with which we all can take from various sectors around this topic. So there's lots of opportunity, lots of movement at the national level.
That brings me to what the Foundation for Social Connection is doing, because you've just issued an action plan.
That's right.
Can you tell me, is it linked to the Surgeon General's report?
Yeah, it absolutely is. So we've been working very closely with the Surgeon General's office around his efforts to catalyze community movement. He's worked very closely with the Council of Mayors across the country. And we've been building off of that work to create an action guide for local leaders. It's a 6-step guide with which communities can take to analyze the needs of their community, the assets that are there, build their own action plan around social connection based off of those needs and structures, implementing that plan, and then looking at how they evaluate and then disseminate the learnings of that plan. So it's not rocket science, but it's certainly a tool that is being taken up. We're seeing movement in Bangor, Maine, San Antonio, the Bay Area, Atlanta, Minneapolis. So all across the country, there's a need for this action guide to be implemented. In addition to that, we host a national event every year called our Ending Loneliness Action Forum. We just held that at Harvard University at the beginning of October. There we highlighted this year building connected communities. So bringing together sort of the global, national, and local leaders around the common topic of how do we catalyze action at the community level. It was quite fruitful. I know you were there, so I'd love your impressions around it. I unfortunately was not. I was in the hospital. But I know that there was a lot of interest in continuing to take those lessons into their communities. So I wondered your thoughts on how that went.
Well, I wanted to go there, but I was actually at the Modern Elder Academy teaching that week, but I've heard great things about it. And Bob Putnam, who's going to speak tonight, I know was one of the participants, along with the Surgeon General. I am related to the action guide to the conference. I'm interested if you were seeing examples of sources of inspiration that are happening, because I know this has been a global phenomenon. Britain has a minister of loneliness. What gives you hope? What are the things you're seeing out there that could achieve the kind of scale that we've been talking about today?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'd just say that one, this sort of national movement that it feels like it's coming to light from these champions in Congress and in the administration, I think is really shining a light and raising awareness across at least the US. We are in this sort of global economy around this topic. So as you mentioned, the UK has had a Minister of Loneliness for over 10 years. There's been several ones along the lines. And they've implemented in their national health system sort of screening and social prescribing. That is coming to light in the US. There's a Social Prescribing USA group that's come together that's working with healthcare providers to implement social prescribing. And they're also looking at how we catalyze community-based organizations to take part in that social prescribing. So there's a lot of interest around this community information exchanges that allows for the backbone for that sharing and prescribing and closing the loop on those services. That's really exciting for me because it's looking at both sides of social services, community-based services, and the healthcare system. I think that there's lots of opportunity that's coming to light with the use of things like the Action Guide and the Surgeon General's report being implemented across the country. So we're very hopeful. I think intergenerational programs are very key. So there's a number of new tech vendors that have come into the market that are looking at how we bring youth into the sort of older adults' social isolation and loneliness equation, but it's bi-directional. They're finding that older adults are actually helping to solve some of the chronic loneliness that is present in youth. So I think more of that coming to market and how we catalyze that is helpful.
As we were thinking about our conversation today, I kept returning to a foundational story for myself, which I thought I'd insert in the conversation. But when we started Experience Corps, which is now run by the AARP Foundation, and they came up in some of the earlier conversations, we weren't thinking about it in this bi-directional way. We were thinking about older people as a vehicle for teaching kids to read by the 3rd grade, to be a source of connection for them. And I remember going to Philadelphia to visit the Experience Corps there, meeting one of the members, a woman named Martha Jones, who told me the story of a gray February day where she was supposed to be going into the Taylor Elementary School, and she just was feeling depressed, and it was sleeting outside, and she pulled the covers over and turned her alarm off. But then she started thinking about the kids and how much she would be missed. And finally, she forced herself to get dressed and take the bus to school and climb the stairs, and she's hanging up her coat. It's a 1920s school building on one of these hooks, and she feels these 2 little arms crawling up behind her. She says, "Somebody loves me." And it was at that moment I realized that this was actually a program that was not only bi-directional, but about love in a fundamental way. And I feel like in so many ways what you've been talking about is really about creating a society with more love. And I thought, we've got 3 minutes and 39 seconds left. So I thought I would just open it up to any questions from the audience, or Marie, if there are any questions online. They can be about the Foundation for Social Connection. They can be about the Coalition to End Loneliness and Isolation. They can be about love. But if anybody does have a question for Eddie, Ryan Frederick. Hi, Ryan.
As part of our action guide, we've been simultaneously building out a community level metric. Their sort of dashboard is not prime time, but it's building off of things like livable communities. It's looking at the work of the World Health Organization and their Social Connections Commission that's been building out similar indices. We're working with the OECD around this as well, but it's not to the level that I agree with you that we need. So we've been working with an organization called Healthy Places by Design, which has been doing community level work for the last 30 years. We're hoping to have a true community level metric that's developed for this express purpose. So more to come. We hear you and we agree.
That's an online question.
Yes. One question from the online audience is, in your work, and I guess that can relate to both of you, how do you think about the loss of traditional structures which created community, such as churches, versus creating new forms of community? And I will add, does that matter when we think of different age groups?
I absolutely think so. There is still a place absolutely for community-based groups, churches, religion as part of this dialogue. There are large swaths of our communities and our people who still identify with those institutions. But to the latter part of your point, we still need to evolve and think about how we think about community in the broadest sense, how we leverage a technological base and advancements that many young people and older people are taking advantage of, so social media. Actually, coming out of the pandemic, there was research suggesting that depending on the community and how you use social media, there were positive effects. For certain communities, there were negative effects in how you use it and the age group that you're in. So I do think we need to be inclusive of all solutions and think about that really, really concertedly.
Commend you on all the great work. I would love to hear about the coalition and how you're trying to expand that, your vision for the future. I venture invest in wellness and mental health, and we've been seeing a lot in the connection and loneliness just really growing from that area.
I really appreciate that. So the coalition was founded 6 years ago, and it focuses on really policy reforms and raising national awareness. The coalition now has, I believe, 60 members. They're nationally based organizations, but many local and community-based organizations as well. We are annually developing a policy agenda that looks at national, state, and local level reforms, and hopefully the sort of through line across those. It looks at various sectors of our economy. So it does look at housing, nutrition programs, older adults, younger adults, children, and of course, healthcare. We welcome all members. So there's a fee to join, but we literally take everybody because we think the issue is so important. I hope that answered your question.
There's a welcoming of negative issues. I want to bring up a problem and see how you respond to it. So I live in a very interesting place, Palm Springs, which has 5 communities, Indigenous people, Hispanics, LGBT+, snowbirds, and so on. And we bring them all together, and it looks like high school. Each group sits at a different table. And my particular organization is Ageless Ambassadors, training people to be volunteers. So these are the creme de la creme of, not being isolated and giving to community. I'm hoping to join in the 6 pillars and bring our community to you very much. It's wonderful to hear. But have you seen that? Is there something natural in human nature where we do separate ourselves by age, by preference, by gender? Because I'm always surprised to see these incredibly giving people who are there with their own money and their own time and really breaking the mold of the leisure life of retirement. They want to be professional volunteers. And yet I can tell you exactly where they're going to sit. It's always been amazing to me, but I don't have the research or the data. And I'd like your response on that.
Yeah, well, I'll say my response is going to be my response. I'm not a neurologist or a cognitive scientist, but I do think that we have information overload as a society, and we always probably have. And in order to simplify how we relate to each other, we look for the biggest common denominator or lowest common denominator. And so I think as we've seen in groups historically, you might see people that look like you and you'll say, oh, we probably have something in common. I know we have one thing. I'll connect with them. I'll be with them. So I think that is a common trait of humanity. But I don't know if anyone's seen the Heineken commercials that were running during the pandemic. But they were, I could share a beer with somebody and talk to, and eventually through that talking and over the course of sharing that beer, you might find a connection to each other. And it was two people that had very different backgrounds, but they still were able to connect if they were forced to in this sort of situation. So I'd say find ways to bring out other forms of connection that might be common characteristics around those populations. Maybe it's surveying, maybe it's doing word clouds, maybe it's doing different activities that might elucidate some of that. Yeah, right.
I'll pick up on what Eddie was saying because I think it relates to your question. We did a study with the National Opinion Research Center at University of Chicago last year, and it showed, to our surprise, deep pent-up demand on the part of older and younger people to connect and also collaborate, and the strongest interest on the part of young people, but two big obstacles. One, in communication, people felt that they didn't know how to talk to each other. They didn't have enough practice. And second, it was too hard. It was a do-it-yourself project. And I think this kind of sorting that you're describing oftentimes happens as a result of those two challenges. It makes it easier to just default to these other arrangements. I want to thank Eddie Garcia. I was going to ask him for some final thoughts, but we had all these great questions. But I'll just ask you one last. Should we have a minister of loneliness in America or of social connection?
Maybe a different title, but yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Eddie.